Our Bible word is 1 Samuel 10 verses 6. Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with him and be turned into another man. So first, let us look at 1 and 2 Samuel. That's necessary because as books, they're not separate, they belong together. They come from the same context and are around similar themes and tell, one long continuous story. And if we look at the history of Israel, if we go back to the beginning, about 1400 BC, that's more or less the time when the Exodus happened, and a bit later the conquest of the Promised Land, and that inaugurated the period of the Judges. And that lasted until about 1020 BC when the first king arrived, and then kings reigned for about 400 years, be it for the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah mostly, until about 586 BC. That's when the destruction of the temple took place. That's when the last king reigned. Then there was a period of exile until about 539 BC. And in that time period, the Philistines also arrived. And they were present in the land of Israel from around the 12th century BC to roughly 604 BC. They were destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. So the same guy who destroyed the temple in Jerusalem also destroyed the Philistines. But they were there for a long part of Israel's history. And the Philistines derived from what is known as the Sea Peoples. And they perhaps came from Crete or Asia Minor. They settled all over the places in the ancient Mediterranean world, and they were very competent sea travelers. I mean, they were expert navigators, very good seafarers, and they traded with all sorts of people. Even as far as England, remains of them have been found. Even in northwest Africa, their presence have been discovered. But they were especially active in the Mediterranean Sea. And they settled in the coastal plain of Palestine. And if you look there on the map, there, Philistia, that's where they settled. But then they started expanding northeastwards into the area of Dan, and they also started attacking the northern Israelite territory. They actually defeated the Israelites in Ephraim. So they were a real menace and a real threat to the 12 tribes at that time. And even Samuel, the prophet, he was also engaged in some campaigns against them and actually also defeated them, but it wasn't permanent. We can read about that in 1 Samuel 7 verses 5 to 14. So the people, with this Philistine threat that's with him, they wanted to have a king now, to unite them and to get rid of this Philistine threat. Because the Philistines, they were settled there along the plain. If we look at this map, those cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, as well as Gath. So they started expanding northeastwards, and they actually attacked Israel in 1020 BC. That's the same year when Saul became king. So this was the time the people called for a king, so that they can be united and confront this threat from the Philistines. So this is what 1 and 2 Samuel is essentially about. It's how Samuel as a prophet, how he anointed Saul as king, but also then how Saul failed as king, and now Saul was replaced by David. So that's basically the structure also of 1st and 2nd Samuel. It contains stories of Samuel's birth and his ministry. It also contains the story of Saul, how he was anointed. But the most of 1st and 2nd Samuel is about David, King David. And also his capture of Jerusalem, when he brought the ark to Jerusalem, and also other events in the life of David. So this is the context that it refers back to, this time of Saul and David, and this fight against the Philistines. But also we must understand 1 and 2 Samuel as part of what is known as the Deuteronomistic history. And this refers to some books in the Old Testament. They contain similar themes and ideas. And the way we have these books came about after the time of the exile. So they have a particular outlook, a particular theology, and it's derived from themes that we find in the book of Deuteronomy. And some of these themes include that only Yahweh must be worshipped. Only Yahweh must be worshipped within Israel. And also worship must be centralized in Jerusalem. Because at this place there were altars and high places all over where people brought sacrifices. Also later on they became places of idolatry. They went after Baal and Asherah or whatever other gods. So the idea of this Deuteronomistic history is no, get rid of those places. There must only be sacrifices in Jerusalem, in the temple. Another important theme of this is that Israelites are God's chosen people. And God has made a special covenant with the Israelites. Also with this came this idea that outsiders must be exterminated through war or conquest. So that's like what we find in Joshua. Joshua is part of this Deuteronomistic history. God, Yahweh is only concerned for the Israelites, for no one else. That's part of this theology. So God has also made a covenant with Israel, and God will bring blessings on Israel if they are obedient. But if Israel's not obedient, they'll be cursed. So they'll be cursed if they are disobedient. So that's a few of these themes that come across in this Deuteronomistic history, derived from the book of Deuteronomy. And the books that is relevant here is Joshua, Judges, 1 and 2 Samuel, and 1 and 2 Kings. So if you read these books, be aware of this particular perspective from some scribal groups that came together after the time of the exile. And they used previous traditions and they wrote these books with this theology in view. Israel's God's special people. There's a covenant with Him. They must obey. If not, they will be cursed and punished, because now they are in exile and now they see the consequence of disobedience. So they write with the benefit of hindsight, so to speak. This is what happens, and this is what we had, a covenant, but the covenant was not kept with God, and now we are suffering the consequences of that through exile. So, part of the Deuteronomistic history. So overall, 1 and 2 Samuel fits in this context of roughly, or it speaks to the history of roughly 1020 BC. When the Philistines started going or invading more and more Israelite territory, and people started calling for a king. And of course, Saul was anointed, and eventually after him, David as well. So if I focus now on our current Bible passage, if we look at the larger unit, it's the arrival of the monarchy in Israel. And that's from chapters 8 to 15. And specifically the anointing of King Saul. That's from chapters 9 verses 1 to 10 verses 16. If we look at that graph again, you can see there at 1020 BC, that's when the anointing of Saul took place. That is also the time period of Samuel. Samuel's regarded as the last of the judges, and also as the first of the important prophets. And it's also when the monarchy arrived in Israel, when the activity of the prophets took place. So the prophets were active mostly when kings were active. And we'll look more at the activity of the prophets a bit later. But the story goes that Saul, he was the son of Kish, who was quite an important man in the tribe. And Saul is also explained he was a tall man, quite an impressive individual. And he was out searching for his father's donkeys. And they walked back and forth looking for the donkeys, and they couldn't find them. And Saul wanted to return, but his servant with him said, "No, there's a man here called Samuel, and he might be able to help us. And Saul then said, well, we can't go to him, we don't have a gift for him. Because it was customary at this time, if you go to see a prophet or a seer, that you give him a gift, whether big or small, it doesn't matter. So the servant said, well, I have a quarter of a silver shekel. We can give that to him. So they went to Samuel's village. There were some young girls drawing water, and these girls told him, well, Samuel is here. He went up to a high place there, because there was some special religious ceremony that was taking place. And this was also, now according to Samuel, orchestrated by God, that Saul would come to Samuel, because God had also revealed to Samuel this would become the king of Israel. So Samuel sees Saul, he recognizes Saul, that this man is now chosen by God to be king, and he invites him to a meal at the high place. Saul sits at the head of the table, so they sit there having a feast along with other people. And then he also goes with Saul goes with Samuel to Samuel's house. They go to the rooftop. There they have discussions, and Samuel wants to prepare him for his anointing as king. And then the next morning the anointing actually took place. He took oil and threw it over Saul's head. That's what anointing actually means, is when you pour oil over somebody's head. And in Israel that meant anointing a priest or a king or even a prophet. They were anointed that way. Now Saul was actually anointed as king in 3 stages, or he became king in 3 stages. First there was the anointing by Samuel. Then he was chosen by Lot, that we can read in chapter 10. And then he was also confirmed as king by public acclamation, that we can encounter in chapters 11. So this was the way that Saul became king, in these 3 stages. He was first anointed, chosen by Lot, and then confirmed by the public. And Samuel also tells Saul there will be 3 signs that will confirm God's choice of him. And the first sign is that Saul will meet 2 men who will verify that Kish's donkeys had been found. In other words, Kish, his father, that his donkeys had been found. So Kish doesn't have to worry anymore about Saul's welfare. The second sign is that 3 men will meet Saul and offer him 2 loaves of bread. Now these men, they will be on their way to worship God at Bethel, but they will meet Saul on the way. So that's a second sign that you'll be given. The last sign is that there will be a procession of a large group of prophets, and they will meet Saul outside the hill of God. And this is, once Saul has met them, this is what will happen, and that's our Bible word. Then the Spirit of the Lord will come upon you, and you will prophesy with him and be turned into another man. So these prophets, they were prophets of Yahweh, and they were enthusiasts for Yahweh, and they said you must only worship Yahweh. And it's often explained that they were filled with spirit, and they would enter states of trance, what we would also call today altered states of consciousness. They would go into trance, and they would speak differently, they would act differently. And now Samuel tells Saul here, this is what will happen to you. You will be associated with these prophets. You will enter a state of trance with them. Now Samuel was actually a leader of these first group of prophets. And these prophets, it's said that they come together in groups of 50 or 100. They consisted mostly of young men. Their activities were associated with music. And like I said before, they were strong enthusiasts for Yahweh. And they prophesied for Yahweh, etc. So somehow Saul the king, he would become part of this band of prophets. And God's Spirit will come on him, and he will also enter these altered states of consciousness and prophecy with them. And this is how people also recognize, now you have been chosen as the king of Israel. So what Samuel told him about that he will receive God's Spirit, that actually happened. If we now go to verse 10. When they came there to the hill, there was a group of prophets to meet him. Then the Spirit of God came upon him, and he prophesied among them. So Saul became part of this group of prophets. But also when he returned home, other people saw him as belonging to this group of prophets. That was a sign for them also. He's the king. If we go to verse 11, and it happened when all who knew him formerly saw that he indeed prophesied among the prophets, that the people said to one another, "What is this that has come upon the son of Kish? Is Saul also among the prophets?" So there's also a sign to them. Indirectly, this man has been chosen by God as king. So this is about roughly 1020 BC, if you follow the biblical history and chronology. This was the time when King Saul was anointed as a king of Israel through Samuel the prophet. It was to help resist the Philistines who were making inroads into their land. And Saul would become king, and of course, eventually things didn't go so well for him because he disobeyed God's instructions, and eventually he was to be replaced by King David.